about a world which is stranger and weirder and full of magic.
Welcome back to Season 3 of Fantasy and Faith. It is my pleasure and privilege to once again host the critically acclaimed and multiple award-nominated Anna Smith-Spark. She's the author of several novels, the most recent of which is A Sword of Golden Ruin, which I have a signed copy here, and the sequel, which is a sequel to A Sword of Bronze and Ash, I should mention. And she also recently had In the Shadow of the Dying published, which she co-authored with Michael R. Fletcher. It's good to have you back again, Anna. Tell the audience what you've been up to.
It's lovely to be back. I've been having a lot of excitement actually. Yeah, so I had A Sword of Golden Ruin came out in September. It came out actually in the same week as my 2018 novel, Anderson versus Death, which is, that's a kind of that very, very different kind of thing. Everyone was like, my God, that's such a different thing if you used to be doing. And then people were like, but it makes so much sense. And I mean, that was just amazing because that was writing about two characters that I've loved since I was a child and that kind of meant a lot to me from when I was a child. I'm an official 2000 AD author. That's just mad. So I did the audiobook for that as well, which was really cool. Those both came out in the same week in September, which was quite a week. And then, so I had World Fantasy Con and a sort of bigger launch event for Golden Ruin, a sort of Golden Ruin there. And then, absolutely brilliantly, I've been, The Cordbreaker Knives has finally been published in both Spanish and Italian. And I had this incredible trip to Spain, to Barcelona, which was just wonderful. They have, it's such a civilized city. I mean, it's always been a civilized city. It was one of the kind of first, that area was one of the first areas that kind of developed basically medieval culture after the collapse of the Roman Empire that counts Barcelona. So it's always been a very cultured city. But they had this event, Festival 42, as in 42, the meaning of life, the universe and everything, that was run by the City of Barcelona City Council. So I was walking down La Rambla, and there were big adverts for it hanging in the kind of one of the most famous tourist streets in Spain. And the whole event was they had lots of authors from all over the world, lots of Spanish authors, obviously, but American authors, British authors. And the whole event was free. But you didn't need tickets, you didn't need membership. You could just go and listen to people. You could just go for one event. You could be there all weekend. And they put all the authors up in a luxury hotel and gave us free meals. And it was just a different sense of the kind of value you put on books and on literacy and on fantasy and science fiction. I was hosted by the City of Barcelona Literary Council because that's the kind of thing they do. It was just wonderful. And I got a chance to wander around and explore Barcelona as well. So it's been, and then I was in, completely bizarrely, I was in what I'm told is the Italian equivalent of the Radio Times. There's a big, which probably means nothing to younger viewers, but for those of us who remember in our childhood the Radio Times, even if you never got it, it was the big TV guide. Even if you never got it the rest of the year, at Christmas your parents would get it, and you go around circling all the films you were going to watch over the Christmas holidays. And I had a big interview as the Queen of Grimdark in the Italian equivalent of the Radio Times. So, which was utterly random, but really cool. And so it's gearing up to be. And then, the next book is out in Spanish in the spring, and I'm off to Spain again in the summer. And really cool things.
I remember one time thinking, if I ever come on Parkinson and get interviewed by him, it means I've made it. Parkinson's no longer interviewing. I mean, it's like Radio Times. One time it was like, if I get into this magazine, I've made it, but nobody reads it.
I know. But I think they still read it in Italy. But
That's
I mean,
good.
it was just, bizarre and extremely cool.
So I have to thank you, first of all, for showing me around at World Fantasy Con, introducing me to Jenny and some other people there. I was really kind of a deer in the headlights all big eyes and looking around, thinking, "Oh, all these people," and you
You were so
took the
snappily
time out.
dressed, brilliantly dressed.
I was. I
Magnificent
think
tweed suit
probably
for
a,
the.
probably a little too well dressed for the event. So in our last conversation, we talked about cycles, war, myth, death, and repetition. The sort of Golden Ruin still moves in cycles, but it feels like they're finally going somewhere. Was it important to you that this book moves forward rather than looping endlessly?
Yes, I mean, yeah, it's a very kind of probably the strangest book I've ever written. I have to say that it's a very sort of strange narrative, but I guess the way I see it, so if A Sword of Bronze and Ashes is essentially it is the classic children's, the children stumble into a fantasy world, whether it's going through a portal into a secondary fantasy world like in Narnia, or I've just been rereading actually Alan Garner's The Sword of Weird Stone of Brisingamen and The Moon of Gomorrah, and that the discovering that the world that they live in is actually more magical, and that kind of the barrier between the kind of mundane world and the sort of magical mythic worlds becomes eroded. And that's so the first book is very much that kind of the children go into that world, but told from the point of view of the sort of adult protector figure who already knows that world and who's sort of trying to protect them. Was a sort of so there is it has the kind of it's very rooted in a very small particular landscape, and there is this kind of joke about them having to go backwards and forwards, and that they end up in say someone's Candor actually says somewhere about she's a mother, she's used to taking long pointless journeys backwards and forwards because that's what you do a lot with children. So it is a very contained book, whereas A Sword of Golden Ruin, it is much more that sense of the mother and the reader going into the strangeness of the child's psychological fantasy world. So that's that kind of in classic children's films, and it's probably much easier to do in film with like Labyrinth and Time Bandits, which are both films that I have seen so many times. And but there's in both of them, of course, you begin to realise that the world is the world of the child's fantasy. So in Labyrinth, you begin to realise that all the things in the world of Labyrinth, are actually in Sarah's bedroom. And it's not so overt in Time Bandits, but at the end, you realise that they're actually the sort of terrible, the sort of devil's palace, at the heart of the sort of ultimate evil. It's made of Lego bricks at one point. Again, it's a child's fantasy. Everything in there you realise is actually the stuff in Kevin's bedroom. So that kind of but there's that kind of strange traveling, going through a whole different series of landscapes. Yeah, without that kind of rootedness, you are just wandering through someone's subconsciousness, and there's no map, and there's no boundaries because it's just going on and changing. So that was something that was important in that story. That sense of you're just moving. It's an utterly surreal world, also. So again, that kind of classic worlds, like classic things like Alice in Wonderland, which you can't map it. It has no boundary. It's not. You can't map a Sword of Bronze and Ashes because it's a fantasy world overlaid on Candor's real world, but it's a very solid place. Well, as A Sword of Golden Ruin, it's what's real and what isn't is incredibly ambiguous, and what's real for any of the characters is incredibly ambiguous. It is all kind of, it could all be a dream essentially. It is that kind of moving through a completely strange landscape, but moving on. It that kind of sense of time moving on, and of the huge changes in time as a parent seeing things is also something that's hugely important to, and the fact that you can't go back. I mean, the terrible things have happened in the first book that they can't go back from. So the second book, they can only go on. Actually, and in some ways, I think a lot about that. The famous ending of The Great Gatsby. In fact, was it so they went on beating against the current. I can't remember, isn't there? They go on beating against the current, and they can never stop. It's that, I can't remember the quote, but it's that sense of just going on, either kind of blindly going on, which is what the Great Gatsby sort of saying. They're just going on, and they're unable to respond to things, and they're unable to think more deeply, or that having to go on because what else can you do?
There's a sense of history layered, one thing on top of each other. And Canda's almost like she's got dementia, where she's struggling to remember which part of history she's in. Is she Kanda? Is she is Kandra? Or is she who she was with the warriors of Rovan? So it's like you keep scratching the surface and revealing um, hidden layers, like at the start of the book, instead of walking around in a field with cows. Um, she's helping build this house, and then later you hear a story where she may have been the person who tore up this exact village several hundred years ago, and now she's back, and she's struck by the fact that everything is normal and things don't start rotting just because she's there because of the evil she did the last time she was in that village. So it's like Bronze and Ash are like aftermath materials. Golden Ruin feels more paradoxical. Beauty pulled out devastation. What does gold mean in this book, and why did it matter that hope here is hard won rather than clean?
Yeah, so it is that kind of, it is very much a kind of afterwards book. So yeah, that sort of sense of how do you move on? Where do you go? I mean, again, that kind of classic. Actually, if you look at original hero stories so the concept, certainly in Western culture, and I'd suspect as they will take a lot of Greek texts, also in Arabic culture, that the story of the hero ends with his death in classical Greek tragedy and in classical Greek stories. So the story of Jason ends with his death. The story of Theseus ends with his death. The Iliad ends with Hector's death, and people always say Achilles is the hero, but actually Hector's probably the hero. So the story which actually builds in that famous Greek quote, "Call no man happy until he is dead," which is totally misunderstood because, of course, what that actually means is the hero's story. They get married and live happily ever after. But then what you don't see is the the problems afterwards. So you end with the hero's death because then you know that it's done. Nothing else worse. Nothing can happen to him worse. And obviously, the ideal is to die. The idea is to get married, get married and live happily. Get married and lived happily ever after, and then they both died. So they don't have the kind of ruination. But that, of course, it's not like that. And actually, a lot of the original Greek hero stories have the kind of very few of those relationships work out. A lot of the heroes actually die horribly in the end. They have very sad endings in their stories. But that sense of, it's not, the story might end, they all lived happily ever after, but people have to deal with it. Or that sense of, it ends, but then people have to go on and deal with the consequences. And so A Sword of Golden Ruin is about, not much happens in it, I guess. It's about dealing with, or not much happens in the present in it, but it's about dealing with the consequences of what happened and how you go on from that. How, you have the great big adventure story and the big kind of climax. And then you have to go on. So that sense of hope being hard won, that sense of you have to cling on to hope, because what are you going to do otherwise? You either give up in despair, or you go on, and you go on hoping, and you cling on to that. But yeah, it's not easy. Again, those kind of very simplistic notions of, well, somehow it's all right. So I think I was talking last time we spoke about that kind of incredibly simplistic, somehow Darth Vader's just forgiven and can go back to being Anakin Skywalker because in his, in that little story where he's reconciled with his son, maybe his son can forgive him, but no one else, or that kind of the way that Lord of the Rings sort of ends with this. The kind of, I guess you leave the fairy tale. The fairy tale ends with, and they all lived happily ever after. Aragorn married his beautiful fairy tale princess. He is crowned king. Presumably, they all go and live happily ever after in their fairy tale kingdom. But actually, the hobbits go back to real life, the Shire, and they can't it's not just the end. They have to try and go on. And at the end of the book is very much about them trying to go on and reintegrate into a normal world. And that sense of, you are changed, you are damaged, you've seen terrible things, even if it ended happily. You've experienced terrible things, you've suffered terrible things, just to say, yeah, but it was all right in the end. It really isn't like that. You don't, otherwise no one on the winning side in the world wars would have suffered PTSD. It's not as simple as that. So that kind of juxtaposition between the ruination and the irreparable damage, and the need to hold on to hope and to hold on to what's important and to carry on and to try and find a way to carry on, is hugely important. I mean, there's a slightly gimmicky, obviously, each book has got a medal in the title, under something under something in a title, because people like that kind of series title, because it shows you these are related books. But there is that sort of thematic nature of it that is part of the reason the titles are given, that kind of sense of, something precious. And obviously, I mean, bronze in the first book, bronze is for weapons, it's for things. With sort of it's clear they're setting the book. There's no references. If you look, there's no references to iron. They don't have iron technology. They have bronze technology. So which was actually a real pain with language, because you can't ever talk about forging anything, because you don't forge bronze. You smelt bronze and cast bronze. So I had to be really careful with the language. But yeah, they're in a Bronze Age technology. So bronze is their primary metal. So their swords are made of bronze. Their helmets are made of bronze. Bronze is a thing you use to inflict damage with. Whereas gold obviously is a thing of precious value. It has no use. It had no culture can ever have any use, because it's too soft to use. It can only ever be a thing that's beautiful. But it is obviously very, very beautiful, very precious. So that juxtaposition in the first book between weapons and tools and ashes and things that are burnt is there, but then obviously, and then it's obviously even stronger in the second book with the contrast between sort of gold and ruin. And then there are obviously sort of reasons around the term gold that you begin to realise as you're reading the book as well, which I will not spoil.
That's
But
not give
yeah,
too much away. Yeah. It seems to be kind of a central theme to the hero's journey, that the hero goes out. They might start off as a farm boy or a farm girl, but when they return, then it's never the same again, because they've changed, and the place that they left may have changed too, or may be the same as when they left, but they're no longer compatible. And the fact that people survived the first book is a big deal, because in Grimdark is not always the case. This book manages to carry hope without flinching. What kind of hope survives realism, and what kind did you deliberately avoid putting in the book?
yeah, and I wanted it to have, I mean, that sense of things not being, not being kind of small hopes, I guess, that sort of sense of things, the sort of small immediate hopes but from that you can change bigger things. It's that kind of, it's that sort of sadness of, I guess, that wanting to change things on a huge macro level, and it just not being possible. But you cling on to what you've got, and you try. And I mean, we those sort of stories, that hopeful lie we tell each other that if we commit, if we carry out little random acts of kindness and are nice to each other, and kind of try and teach our children to be good and better people and all of that somehow, and support our local communities, somehow that will make those kind of big changes. That somehow, if we just, if we're just nice to the people, and if we're nice to our neighbours, and if we're nice to people in the street, and somehow that will change their voting intentions. And you kind of know it's just crap. It's not gonna, it's not going to work. But what else can you do? I mean, what else can we do at the moment other than sort of hang on to some idea that kind of, by being decent to each other and caring to each other and looking out for each other, somehow that means the people with guns don't win, even though kind of that belief that being kind is somehow an act of resistance, which, I mean, we have to hold on to that, because what else have we got? But at the same time, that kind of despair that...
Yeah, we're funny like that because even in stories, whether it's film, book, or video game, when somebody's committed some evil in their past, and then the protagonist, does a few good deeds, and we're always willing to forgive everything that's gone before. And it's like we're constantly optimistic. Oh, this person doesn't deserve to die now because, look, they helped that cat out of the tree, or they saved that little girl from the fire. So that should wipe out all of the deeds. But in vengeance stories, vengeance still has to be served, regardless of how good this person's become, unless
Yeah,
the person who's...
So I'm really dubious. I really struggle with kind of, those redemption narratives and vengeance narratives. I really struggle with, because they both almost strike me as equally problematic. I mean, the kind of redemption narrative that somehow it's all right. You can just sort of say, well, it's fine now. This person has sort of, they are forgiven and they're simply reintegrated in the community. And that sense of, but what about all the people who suffered? What, don't they get any say in this? Is it's that kind of very kind of egocentric, well, I'm sure if I did something bad, everyone will just forgive me, because how could they not? Because, I don't want to, I mean, none of us wants to feel that if we did something bad, we'd have to spend the rest of our life being outcast and exercised from the community. So therefore, it's nice and comforting to hold on to that idea. All you have to do is say sorry and do some redemptive act, and then sort of... And I'm certainly not saying that, the other side of that is that kind of, that sort of thing where, people are kind of hunting out, look, this person made a racist or a homophobic tweet 10 years ago, and they may have apologised for it, but that means that we can never, ever, they'll be damned for that forever if they have apologised for it and talked about the fact they've moved on from it. But at the same time, that it's so easy, we're just going to say, redemption arcs are so easy. But equally, I'm really troubled by the way that so many stories, vengeance is taken, seeking revenge is taken as a kind of positive. I'm always quite surprised. I always assume that it's going to be, at some point down the line, the person's going to realise that vengeance isn't what they're looking for. And then I'm always just, or that, we're going to have it's going to be implicit in the text that they may be seeking vengeance, but actually it's not going to heal anything, and it's actually problematic. And it's, if we've got, the lone gunman out for vengeance, that means they're an anti-hero or an antagonist, rather than they're not the hero. Again, this sort of, like I watched a lot of kind of classic fantasy films and kind of, or James Bond films and things, and didn't actually realise that main character was supposed to be the hero, I thought they were supposed to be the anti-hero, because I thought you're supposed to kind of realise that them going around being like, oh, I'm really opposed to violence, punch someone in the face. And similarly, that kind of, it really troubles me. I always assume that there's a deeper political subtext about vengeance narratives and seeking revenge. And then I realise for most books it's not. It's just the obvious thing to do is you get revenge. And that, yet both of those are equally troubling to me. I mean, maybe my life is just incredibly morally complicated and I live in a kind of horrible, constant morass. And it would be really nice if I could simply believe I get in either just the redemption narrative and or just the vengeance narrative. But I'm really troubled by both of them, which I think does also come out in all my books, that kind of where you go from that and how you move on and how you deal with trauma and how you deal with people who've committed terrible acts is, and how you kind of manage that in your society.
Do you play video games, Anna?
No, I don't. No, mainly, no, I briefly was completely addicted to a couple of video games, but no, I couldn't. I think I'd either get really frustrated with them or I'd stop writing and just play them. The same reason I don't do tabletop role playing anymore. I would never write anymore.
The temptation is real.
Yes.
So there's this game called The Last of Us Part 2. You probably heard of the TV series version of it. So you got two protagonist type people. You got Abby and you got Ellie. Ellie's on a vengeance arc and Abby's her target. But Abby's on a redemption arc. So she's done something horrible at the beginning. So by the end of the game, she's supposed to have gained redemption by saving another life. But Ellie's vengeance arc has got to end with her taking Abby's life. So it sets up that tension between, who is the good guy, who's the bad guy, and who are you backing? What outcome do you want from this? Because at the beginning you want Ellie to kill Abby, but by the end of it, it's not so straightforward. So I feel like Kanda has a similar kind of arc where she had this whole kind of fire and vengeance and brimstone, but now she's on kind of a path of redemption and she's been trying to redeem herself from all of her past sins. Whereas before she just disappeared into the fabric of the countryside, tried to live a quiet life. But now I feel that she's actively seeking to redeem herself as well.
I think she's also.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think she's also aware that that was a glorious time in her life. That kind of she had vast power, and also that was a kind of, that was a time in her, that was a long period in her life. That sense of people, the complexity of people's personalities was something I wanted to talk about as well. That she's aware that she was happy at that time. She's aware that that was a time where she was incredibly powerful and had incredible status and had these amazing experiences. She was living her best life in some ways, and that it's not, and that her feelings about that time are ambiguous. And again, it's not as simple as just saying it was a bad time and I'm sorry. She's aware that it's more complicated, that she did these things. And there was a part of her then that obviously wanted to do those things, which presumably means that there's a part of her now that would want to do those things. She's changed, but no one changes that vastly. She's still the same person she was then. She's a complicated person, but she's not kind of, she's revolted by who she was then, but she's also aware that that is her, that is a part of her, and that kind of, that sense of her as being complicated, and that sense of, again, probably most of us have done things, probably apart from you. You're talking at that. The last BFS thing I heard you talk about, you were talking about saying you had your wildlife, and then there was a pause, and I'm like, no, wait. I don't think, but yeah, most of us have done things in our life that we probably are deeply ashamed of and deeply regret, but we did them. And even if you say, that I was a different person, then well, you weren't. That was you. and most of us have probably done things that we say we deeply regret and are deeply ashamed of. But I mean, Candace says at one point in the first book, she can see how it happened, and she can see how if it was to happen again, it would happen like that again, because that's who she is. And most of us probably, you can see, you did something awful, but there's possibly a part of a lot of us that still thinks like, well, yeah, if I hadn't been caught, if they hadn't found out, if I hadn't, or just kind of, I do really, I don't want anyone to know, I won't want to confess it, but I do enjoy that. I did enjoy it. I did feel good about it because we did it. Apart from you.
So last time we talked about faith as something fractured or failing. Does this sequel move towards renewed faith or changed faith? And can belief survive once innocence is gone?
Oh, I guess it... Again, it kind of has to, because what are you going to do otherwise? You kind of have to hang on that kind of... I think a lot of it does all just come back to trying to survive and trying to love people. And that means you have to go... So much of it just comes back to you have to kind of try and go on and carry on. And I think... I mean, it's difficult because I don't have religious faith in the way I know you do. But I suppose I guess I want to, which does not... My mum once actually had an unfortunate experience when she actually said this to Jehovah's Witness. They came to the door and said something like, kind of, would you like to believe in an all-loving, all passionate God who will kind of whisk you up to heaven when you die? My mum said, well, obviously I would, which then obviously unfortunately led the Jehovah's Witness to think this meant she desperately wants to be converted. But I kind of want desperately to believe in... I'd have a deep faith and love for... I suppose I do have a really deep faith in the idea of life as something good, and that you've got to hang on to that kind of sense of... It does seem to me a kind of... Any act of cruelty seems to me a kind of utter abomination against... Call it God, or call it love, or call it the life force in the universe, but that sense of, we're alive and the world is a beautiful place, and it just seems an abomination against that fact that people commit, inflict any kind of suffering or destroy things, or acts of destruction, acts of cruelty, do feel as if they are some kind of abomination against something far greater. And I guess if I didn't have that, I'd just go mad. It's kind of... I mean, that's sort of... I sort of often talk about, something like H.P. Lovecraft. His ultimate horror is the concept that at the centre of the universe, there is that kind of gibbering, insane, witless void. And that notion that at the centre of the universe there isn't life, there's the kind of idiot void, is just that is the, I guess that is the terror. That is the one thing that I do find terrifying about cosmic horror, because it is genuinely terrifying, the idea that there is genuinely nothing. So that notion of hanging on to having to have faith in something, even if it's only, I will get through today without shouting at my children. I will get through today, and there is something, the smell of a good cup of coffee, or seeing my cat will give me a sense that there is something good in the world. Because if you don't hang on to that, then it is just the gibbering mindless void. And that is terrifying, the notion that, I suppose, the notion that suffering isn't a blasphemy against something is too horrifying to contemplate. And that, I think, is what, I think that's there in all my writing, that kind of sheer terror of that. And I guess you would call that God, and I would probably agree with you, but in a kind of a much less defined way. But if that, without that, there's just what possible without that, it's just too horrible. It is just too bleak.
I mean, for us, God is the explanation for how everything else can work. Without God there to prop up everything collapses, because everything is contingent on something else. So there has to be like a full stop, and that full stop is God. So rather than it being some empty, gibbering, chaotic madness, there is a sense of control and order and balance. And I think that's one thing that people have a problem with Christianity, is that kind of, well, God is love. But if God is love, then why do we have suffering in the world? And in Islam, we see God as being all things. Um, God is the balance between all things. It's all the good qualities that we want, but God is also capable of destruction as well as creation. So when something bad happens, we don't automatically think, well, how can this be possible if God is love? We're going off topic a little bit.
No, because I think it is in that notion of the kind of what, that very kind of sort of, that sort of, I mean, it's so kind of classically asked, is that actually there was a very, very bizarre but really kind of actually quite thought-provoking article by a Church of England, a member of the Church of England clergy, called Ravi Holy, which is a superb name, who was talking about this sort of jokey. It came from this jokey thing about someone saying there'd been a football team had won a football match, and there'd been this joking thing about, well, it was obviously because the owner of one of the football matches happens to be quite a devout Christian, and he prayed. And then, so it actually opened up quite this big thing about, so if the kind of, if the Christian God intervenes to kind of means one team wins a football match that they need to win, but isn't intervening to save dying children, or, didn't intervene to save a nurse who was shot by ice, what on earth does that, what does that say? And it actually led to this kind of really interesting argument people were having about what that might mean, and that kind of, and that kind of, it was just people, I mean, it was comic, but it was also kind of that notion of kind of, what good is, and what the purpose and the nature of suffering is, and how suffering can be allowed, and what kind of, and of course, other football fans were kind of chipping in saying like, well, I wasn't very pleased. But that kind of complex thing of what does it, that kind of, that sort of eschatology of how does the world function? How does, what does good and evil actually mean? Or what does kind of redemption, what does suffering mean? And that, I mean, again, that very kind of simplistic kind of notion that, well, suffering is there for a purpose because you learn from it. And that versus, I suppose, a kind of more, you, some sort of, needing to find hope is something you need to hang on to. It's not necessarily that all that kind of, you hang on to the good fragments, and you hang on to the fact that it gives meaning. And that doesn't mean that to suffer is somehow morally good or a moral lesson. It simply means, obviously, it means that it exists. But the point is to just try and hang on to the kind of the things that keep you sane and keep your life bearable, or something. And that kind of, which is a very different thing from kind of that notion of kind of, well, you are this bad thing happened to you as a lesson. It's kind of, it's more intangible than that, I think, for me.
I mean, we're kind of talking about free will and inevitability, which leads me to my next question. So, Bronze and Ash, it seemed like the conflict was inevitable. It was fated, almost prophesized that kind of would meet with those three again, and that there would be some kind of confrontation between them. Does the sort of Golden Ruin push back against this sense of inevitability, or does it just redefine what escape looks like?
I suppose part of it is simply that you can't just kind of forget, and so, you can't just say, well, that's done, that's in the past and it's done. You can't escape the past, which is kind of what Candace trying to escape it, but you can never escape it. And even if she'd never met the three of them again in her life, the fear that she might, the shadow that she might, would always be there. So they would always be with her. But that, I don't believe in fate. So that kind of sense of, that it could have been that she could have just, I think she could have gone on her whole life without them ever being there. It was just genuinely they happened to stumble upon her. But she could never escape them, because you can never escape your past. You can deal with it in different ways. And that was sort of, so, I mean, in fact, at one point in the book, at one point in the first book, she sort of talks about, there's this, again, sort of, it's very much the kind of traditional trope of children's stories where one of the characters has this kind of strong prophetic sense that if they go to a particular place, something terrible will happen. If they go to Malanwen, he will die, the world will end. And that's a kind of, it's a thing. And the fact that it can come true, but also it doesn't have to be the end. That even if something seems inevitable, you can still go beyond it and move on, and things can change, and that you can interpret it in different ways and try and you can move on from things, is something that's important. That, I mean, there's a lot of that in my first series, in Empires of Dust, where how much of what's happening is in some way foreordained, or is some way, again, a kind of repeat of what's happened in the past, and how much everything that happens to Mareth is somehow foreordained, or somehow kind of, how much he is some kind of chosen one figure, where what happens to him is somehow foreseen to happen, and that he is inevitable, and that how much, because he's convinced it's inevitable, it's therefore happening he's doing these things because he thinks it's inevitable, so he's doing them and he can't escape it. And the fact that he believes this about himself means that he's making it happen. is a kind of really key point of those books, that kind of what would have happened if he just sort of decided, okay, I don't need to do this. I don't need this. I don't need to be this person. And that, which Candace, I think, deals with much better, that she's aware that, she doesn't need to be this person. She doesn't need to do these things. But yeah, I think she probably actually has a lot more. She's possibly has a greater sense that the world is in fact predestined. I mean, she's a creature of magic. She has some kind of sense that she lives in a world in which she is part of. If there is a magical structuring, she's created by some being who has some kind of god or a god. She has some kind of part of that kind of supernaturally structured world. But she's able to live much more freely within it. Whereas Marith is very probably just a man in a world with free will. In a world where we don't have, he's not part of the kind of the supernatural structure or the divine structure. He's a man living in a human world. And yet he feels completely bound by the notion of the future and by the notion of his identity being preordained, and everything that will happen, his fate being preordained, and he can't escape it. So, and I think that paradox is something I was interested in kind of creating, because often those kind of, again, they're often in that those kind of sense of the kind of the supernatural characters in fantasy, the elves, the gods, have that kind of, we're all we're bound. The magic workers, there's often those bits where magic workers have to explain, you can't do that. The magic rules say you can't do that. The magic's rules say it works like this. And Canda's kind of aware of that. And then you have the humans kind of say, well, why do the magic rules say it has to work like this? Because that's how the magic rule, that's the conceptual framework within this universe works. And Canda is part of that that magical conceptual theological framework, but she's got much more free will, and that sense of her being really strong, but also being a being of power, but also being a being of power who is much more free, was something that I kind of really wanted to go with her and explore with her. That kind of, characters like Galadriel seem very, very bound. They seem very kind of, they've got all this power, but they never use it. They're just very kind of, well, this is the way the universe works. And to have her having all that power and but just having a freedom is something that was quite important.
There's a joke about Gandalf as well, that despite being one of the most powerful people in Middle Earth, all he does is lights the end of his staff and open the door.
Yeah, I know, it's really, really
about all the
interesting
magic.
book, because he never. Everyone always thinks it was a book absolutely saturated with magic, but there's actually no magic. And actually, it was interesting. I was in the panel a while ago where someone was saying, it was a panel about religion in. It was a panel about religion in fantasy, and so people were talking about, and I think actually you touched on this a bit in the BFS event you did about Muslim fantasy, that the kind of big theological underpinnings. So a lot of books, like, Steve Erickson's books, you have got a whole pantheon of gods who are very involved in the world and are kind of like superheroes. And again, they talk a lot about rules, and they have rules that they obey or don't obey. And we were talking about that, people talking about the different pantheons they've created, and kind of, and then one of the people sort of said, well, if you look at the Lord, there's no religion in the Lord of the Rings. What religion is Frodo? And of course, like, well, he's the Catholic, obviously. Everybody in the Lord of the Rings, it is a very Christian book. It's just God is never mentioned. But that sense, it's actually like a text like Beowulf, which is a book, a story composed for a newly Christian audience, and there are a couple of references to God in it, in fact, but describing a pre-Christian world. So it's got this really careful tension about the fact that gods, in the sense of Anglo-Saxon gods, and magic, in the sense that pagan Anglo-Saxons would have believed in it, is never mentioned. So Grendel and the dragon are almost just natural phenomena. You could imagine Grendel as like some kind of huge kind of gorilla thing who just happens to be loose, because you can't talk about them being supernatural, because you're living in a Christian world where you don't have supernatural beings like that, because they don't fit within your conceptual framework. So you just kind of don't talk about it. So it's a Christian story, but not. That kind of really interesting tension around where kind of faith operates, or what the religious underpinnings of the book of a story operates, is something that's really interesting. And the more you kind of think about that kind of trying to get into that kind of thinking about trying to think about the actual kind of universe in which the story inhabits is something I'm getting more and more interested in. That kind of trying to kind of understand that, kind of think about that a bit more, think about the really, really kind of complex layering of. If that's not just going totally off, I think that's going totally off the point, but it's just something that struck me as quite interesting a little while ago. Quite interesting.
You said the D word though, so we're gonna have to talk about dragons a little bit. So, I mean, if you think in fantasy, you get two different types. You get the kind of supernatural, spiritual, super intelligent beings like Smaug, or even like in Jenny Hanford's books, where the dragons are almost godlike. They control the gateways and make sure that nobody's jumping from world to world. And then you got the more kind of normal, natural dragons like Melanie Rowan's Sunrunner's Fire in those books. The dragons are just majestic animals. Or even in is it Catherine Kerr's Dragon Riders of Birth? Uh, Again, they're flying animals that they use as steeds. So there's this sense that they're just a part of the landscape, they're part of the flora and fauna of that reality, and no more special than a horse might seem to us, or a giraffe for that matter. So, what's your take on dragons?
See, I really like. I suppose because they are just so wondrous. I have to see them as something more, as something strange and supernatural. I kind of, I always feel really disappointed when they are just dinosaurs that happen to be still hanging around, which is how that kind of, when they're just monsters, I kind of, that sense of them having something more to them is something that I find fundamentally important to them. I suppose they're just, maybe it's just because those are some of the quite early dragon stories I read. So, I mean, the Ursula Le Guin's The Dragons in her Earthsea books, which I completely just shamelessly completely ripped off for the dragons in Empires of Dust. They are huge, wise, somehow all-knowing, and that kind of notion that once she has this wonderful notion they're the only beings that can lie in the kind of high magical tongue from which the world is created, and that notion that they can lie in it because they're somehow more than people is something I love that. I was absolutely love that notion. But yeah, I was always really disappointed. We had a big book of dragon stories when I was little, and some of them had the kind of those sort of supernatural, powerful dragons, and Chinese dragons, who again obviously kind of they are divine, they are beings of wisdom. But then so that there are actually a lot of English folklores for stories where the dragon is just a big thing. So stories like the Lambton Worm. I mean, the Lambton Worm arguably isn't a dragon, but so the story of the Lambton Worm it's a really massive worm, basically. It's usually interpreted as being a dragon but actually the book we had, the picture did just show it as an absolutely stonkingly huge worm. Which, so that, and I really just found that so boring and limiting. There's a story, there's quite near where I live, in one of the villages not far from here, there's a church, there's a tombstone of someone who supposedly killed a dragon. And that is definitely a kind of English folklore. It was a big, scary monster, but very much a biological kind of just a big, scary, dumb monster, like the Lambton Worm. And I always found those really, really sad and really just kind of wrong, because I want the world to be. I want the world to be more magical. I want the world to be magical and strange and full of wondrous beings. And I really want to believe it. I guess I almost do believe it. And I kind of hang on to that. And yeah, so I want dragons to be strange and powerful and divine. I want them to be as somehow as gods, or as a way of seeing the world as greater and stranger. I mean, the stories like the sort of story again, the sort of like, there's different tellings of the Phoenix story, and some of the versions of the Phoenix legend where the Phoenix is, I guess, is symbolic. I suppose the fact that something is symbolic. The Lambton Worm is not symbolic. The Lambton Worm is just a really big, a big monster. It's just, it is just a big worm. While there's that kind of notion, whereas Le Guin's dragons, or some of the more kind of religiously symbolic stories of the versions of the Phoenix legends, it's almost like there's something there that has some kind of secret in it that we can't ever understand, but that has a message and a meaning about the world and life that we'll never really be able to understand. But it is almost like a symbolism and that's, I think, what makes them so powerful. That some of those creatures so powerful and so much more interesting and complex. The one thing I really always find really limiting about in Greek mythology is their monsters, because they're always just they are just big. They're just big wandering monsters. They don't have that numinous kind of strange magical quality to them that there is in. There's a very sort of strange, numinous, powerful quality in some monsters in Norse myth, because you've got much more of a sense of they're part of a kind of they're part of a very different conceptualization of the world, where they're kind of almost symbolic. They exist, but they don't quite exist, and they have some kind of relationship to your entire theological structuring of the world, and your sense of the supernatural, and your sense of the divine, and your sense of what the purpose of existence is, that they don't have in Greek mythology.
So to bring this to a bit of a head, what is the core question of the Sword of Golden Ruin, and what do you hope stays with the reader after the final page is turned?
Oh, that the world. I mean, there's a lot of kind of. Oh God, I'm not sure there is. I mean, it ends with them just going on. There are a lot of really, really strange things that happen in the book, and this sort of, again, this sense. Some of the scenes are written with me essentially trying to get into that tunnel, into that kind of real strangeness that there is for me, in Norse and Celtic myth as it's now as it was rewritten. So a lot of these myths, they are the products of a pagan worldview, and then they're written down essentially by monks, because they're the only people who are literate at that time. So they're written down by people who have some understanding of that worldview, because it is their cultural stories, but it's also totally different because they're Christians writing down something which is utterly unchristian. And that tension there of, there's so much meaning here, there is so much symbolism here, there's so much here that is people trying to have quite complicated philosophical dialogue about the way the universe works, but the person writing it down doesn't grasp that, and doesn't want to grasp that, because they're coming from a totally different theological and philosophical perspective. And that kind of sense of, I can nearly see something in there, but I can't quite. I can kind of see how it makes this weird thing that's happened. I can kind of see how it makes sense. I can kind of see there's something huge in there, but I can't grasp it. And then obviously I'm reading that from a totally, much further remove in time and in the whole way I see the universe. And I tried to almost write the making of this world ruined, and particularly a Sword of Golden Ruin, like that there's stuff in it about a world which is stranger and weirder and full of magic. And to some of the characters in that book, maybe it makes complete sense. It's trying to be about going into someone's subconscious and going into a world that makes sense to some of the people in it, but doesn't make sense to us, and trying to make the world's things seem strange, and ask questions which aren't necessarily answerable. I mean, in the end, it's sort of saying, well, what matters is trying to hold on to people you care about. And even if you hugely disappoint them, and they hugely disappoint you, and even if you have a huge amount of shame and grief about who you are and about who they are, and even if you've hurt them and they've hurt you, trying to love them and trying to find a way to carry on, and trying to just carry on and go on and bear all of that and not give in to, and not, I mean, so what else are you going to do? Not in a kind of simplistic, well, they had to learn from that to be better people, but in a sense of, well, they can't do anything else. They can only go on. So they have to go on. And that, yeah, all of those things, it's kind of, but yeah, in the end, yeah, all of that, it just, yeah. I don't know. I don't know. I just write this stuff. I don't know.
So at World Fantasy Con, during your author panel, you gave me a great piece of advice, which was to read widely, not to just stick to the genre that I'm writing in, to read poetry, read some classics. What other piece of advice would you give writers who may be struggling with finding a voice themselves?
Keep going. Keep trying. Keep going. Don't listen to that voice. Everyone has a voice that tells you this is this is terrible, this is rubbish, this is really rubbish. But just keep writing. Try and ignore that voice. Which is interesting. Someone told me that a friend of mine told Alan Stroud said he writes best when he's a bit tired, because when he's a bit tired, that voice tends to go away. And which I hate writing when I'm tired, but I can see what he means. That you're just kind of writing rather than the bits, the kind of all those different levels of your brain that are picking things apart are kind of a bit switched off. But write only for yourself. Write for yourself. Write not for anyone else. I've started saying this, and people really love this, but like write like you dance at your best friend's wedding. I mean, assuming you're happy your best friend's getting married. If your best friend is in fact marrying the person that you've always loved, or your best friend is marrying someone you can see is going to be a disaster, then. But assuming your best friend's wedding day or your brother or sister's wedding day was a happy day for you, that assuming you kind of felt, yeah, someone I love is getting married or in having a civil partnership or whatever with, someone that they really care about, and this is good, I'm happy for them. Like the way you might have danced or sung at that wedding, like the way you might have kind of, just been like, because you're happy, not because for no reason other than, and you're not thinking about showing off your moves because you're trying to pull, or you're kind of performing because you're trying to impress people, or you're trying to show people what a good dancer you are. You were just, I'm just really happy, so I'm dancing or singing, and that. Try and write like that, which is easier said than done. But write for yourself and write for the enjoyment of writing and creating something. Because why else are you doing it? Kind of, in the end, you must be doing it because you want to enjoy it. So enjoy it. And yeah.
What are you currently working on, and what are you currently reading?
I'm currently working on the third and final book in the Making of This World Ruined. So, which is, it's always weird writing a third book because you kind of know it's the end, and it's kind of strange. I find it quite difficult because there's always a part of me that just wants to put and then some stuff happened, but you don't need to bear about that because here's the end. Because that kind of sort of, I'd be terrible writing a detective novel or something, because I'd be like, and then some stuff happened, but you don't need to bear about that because here's the end. Because you do have this weird sense of like, well, we're just messing around before we get to the end. So, but yeah, and it's also strange because it's kind of sad because it's the final book. But yeah, and actually what I'm reading at the moment is I am rereading The Cattle Raider Cooley, the greatest of the stories in the Ulster cycle, the kind of, which are these incredibly interesting stories because, they were written, as I said, they are first written down in early medieval Ireland. They're written down by monks, because monks are the only people who can write. So they're written down by people who are living in a really quite curious Christian community. But they are obviously very, very old and pre-Christian. And there's obviously stuff in them which has huge religious significance to the people who were first creating these stories, but which is just totally, the people writing these down for the first time didn't understand it. And for us now, for me now reading it, it's just so far away from anything I could experience. But there's obviously a whole utterly very different way of looking at the world, which is there. And you can see really interesting stuff in them, which is there in a lot of stories all the way across Eurasia, and they're kind of shared elements. So people they are used as evidence for people talking about the spread of Indo-European culture and the spread of kind of Indo-European languages and, in fact, farming. But they're just such incredibly interesting stories, and they're from a world which is just totally, the whole fundamental nature of the world that they're written in is very, very different, and the language is just quite astonishing. So they're a huge influence on the making of This World Ruin. The language is just something else. It's just quite incredible, the poetry and the language in them. And yeah, there's just Cattle Raid of Cooley is a story that it's incredible. It's absolutely astonishing story. But I'm reading that partly actually because I'm going to be guest of honour partly because I read these stories a lot when I'm writing, so I tend to read a lot of the kind of stuff I'm writing that's helps to create the world I'm writing in. So I read these stories a lot while I'm writing Making This World Ruined. But also I'm going to be the guest of honour at the first NornCon, which is a convention in Belfast, in the hotel that they had the EasterCon in Belfast a couple of years at, and which is quite near Navanfort, which is where these stories were set. I mean, it's quite incredible. It's like reading the Morte d'Arthur, because you're going to be going somewhere where you're going to get to go to tour the ruins of Camelot. It is kind of, the Emin Macha, which I'm sure anyone who speaks Irish Gaelic will tell me I'm pronouncing totally wrong, which is the sort of centre of the central place for the stories in the Ulster cycle. That's Navanfort. I'm going to be able to go there and stand there and be in the central place for these incredibly old, incredibly strange, incredibly beautiful myths, and which is that's just going to be amazing. It's going to be absolutely wonderful. I'm so excited about that. So yeah, I know there's stories I try and reread. It's like reading the Iliad and then going to Troy, which is obviously a real place, but it's that level of amazingness. So yeah, so I'm really, really excited about that.
Thank you very much for giving us your time again and answering all my questions. Well, Anna, it's been a pleasure having you on the podcast again. And I'd like to appeal to my audience now. If you haven't subscribed, do subscribe. If you want to see more of Anna, drop some comments and we'll try to get her on again. I'm sure she'll be happy to join us in a few more months' time, 6-7 months.
Oh
maybe
yeah, I love these
have a chat around.
conversations. They're brilliant. They're really, really interesting conversations. I love it. Yeah, I really enjoy doing conversations.
Thank you. And I hope they'll see our FantasyCon as well, and we can
Yes,
talk there then as well.
yes, definitely. Yes. Yes, I didn't get to speak to you at all at World Fantasy Con. My agent made me work so hard. I barely got to speak to anyone. I'm looking forward to maybe getting to relax a bit and chat to people a bit more at these conventions this year.
So with that, I'll say thank you once more, and thank you to the audience for tuning in. And as always, keep dreaming, keep writing, and let your story shine.